people from the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Thiong'o is here somewhere, over there, and there are other staff from the National Institute as well. Thanks for taking care of the logistics for part of this. I also just want to acknowledge some staff from the university as well who have been involved in working with the Daily Dispatch to organize this event and working with the Institute. Of course, the one person, and thanks to him, Professor Xolela Mango, I want to say a little bit about him. Professor Mango is the person who kind of did the groundwork and the backroom kind of lobbying, pushing, convincing to try to get the money for this event. And I'll say a little bit more about who he is. Just to acknowledge, for the benefit particularly of Professor Ngugi, a number of people that are in the room that we did not have the opportunity to introduce in the other room. Professor Ngugi, I just want to introduce that we have here one of the Deputy Vice Chancellors of the university. Professor Mayende is over there just raise your hand. Yes. I want also the Dean of Research next to him, Professor Akpan. And then the Deans of Faculty, Professor Moyo, just raise your hand, Dr. Lubisi, the Dean of Law, and the Dean of Humanities and Social Science, Professor Chocho. And then there are other people as well, the many that for me to acknowledge here. But also I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the former Vice Chancellor of Walter Sisulu University, Professor Marcus Baluntulo is here. But also very importantly, I want to acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Mtabisi Jonas is here in the front row. I just want to steal this opportunity to say to the Deputy Minister of Finance, but we'll have a thing on the side. The University of Fort Hare is well on its way to greatness. It's well on its way to greatness. And we're going to need friends in high places. We're going to need friends in high places as we walk that journey. Thanks for coming. And for any other person that I may not have noticed, who is here, who requires acknowledgement, welcome and thank you for coming. Now, just very briefly, Professor Mango, and I need to just introduce him because he's going to be the MC of this afternoon, of this event this afternoon. And again, it's merely a coincidence that I've known Professor Mango while I was at Wits. And then I sort of, our paths met again at UCT, and we've been together there for the last 3 years. And welcome, Professor. I don't know who's following whom here. But Professor Mango is a professor of sociology at UCT. He was most recently the Harry Oppenheimer Fellow at Harvard University, and currently holds the Mecca Anyoku Visiting Chair at the Institute for Commonwealth Studies at SOAS, School of Advanced Study at the University of London. Earlier this year, he was elected a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He is the author and co-author of 9 books, including Biko, a biography, which won the UCT Meritorious Book Award for 2015. He's currently working on a biography of Nelson Mandela. Professor Mango serves on the editorial board of Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Journal of the American Sociological Association. And Professor Mango, as I said, is currently on sabbatical from UCT and is at University of London to take advantage of their fellowship. Professor Mahmoud, thanks very much. And
I want to state categorically that Fort Hare is the most important university in the intellectual history of this country. and in the intellectual history of this continent. Which also means in the intellectual history of the Black diaspora. It is a historical fact that Ngugi and I were talking about. You'll notice I say Ngugi, not Ngugi. That's the proper pronunciation. And we were talking about the role that this university has played in the generation of ideas since, in fact, the early 20th century. In fact, since its founding, since before its founding, actually, in 1916. For as early as 1905, black people in this part of the world got together, called something called the Lovedale Convention in 1905 by John Thiong'o and a whole series of people, including, I might say, my great-grandfather. In fact, I might add that there's new research that has come out that the motion in 1905 to establish a university for black people in South Africa, because at that time black people were sending, there were no universities, so people were sending their children all over the world for higher education. And a colleague of mine has discovered that that motion to establish a university here was actually put forward by Jamal. But it was seconded by Peter Kamzash. So I take great pride in this institution. As I said earlier on, Ngugi is not new to the Eastern Cape. Many, many people around the world, wherever I go, and this is a challenge to the leadership I'm putting forward. Wherever I go in the world, I'm at Harvard University now, I'm traveling between Harvard University and the University of London. People are fascinated, absolutely fascinated. I've got a colleague at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who I work with very closely. And he cannot believe that we have not done what we need to do in recording and institutionalizing the intellectual history of the Eastern Cape. Put up a museum, put up a library, put up something, for God's sake. Because no region, Ngugi was telling me earlier on, there is no region on the African continent, perhaps except for Egypt, that has had as much of a role to play, that has had that kind of condensation of intellectuals as this part of the world. Not anywhere on the continent. And the only places we were talking about were Egypt and India, which goes back, of course, thousands of years. And so there is something that really needs to be done, Mr. Vice Chancellor, I don't know if I'm applying for a job, to record this history and put it in the syllabus. And that brings me to the subject of why these lectures, why the National Institute for the Humanities and the Social Sciences under the leadership of Professor Musweka, who could not be here, but was ably represented by her staff, that when we first had this discussion, the idea was that all over this country there is this movement by students to decolonize universities, to reimagine universities, and to reimagine them in our own image. And not just symbolically, but to actually use this material. I mean, the material that I'm talking about is there in the archives. I'm talking about Nkai, I'm talking about his writings, I'm talking about Khubusana, I'm talking about Soga, I'm talking about Makiwane, you know, I could go on Jabavu, the list just goes on. And when I got to the University of Cape Town, my boss will tell you, When I got to the University of Cape Town to teach sociology, and I found in the syllabus the same material that I was taught 40 years ago when I was doing first year at Wits. Right? Yeah, I know. I look good for man. But when I went to Wits University in 1983, I swear, the texts were Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Parsons. So I get to UCT, I say to my colleagues, no way, there's no way I'm going to teach this stuff. There's no way I'm going to do that. You cannot teach the same thing for 40 years, year in, year out, and tell me that's not stagnation. And so I said to my colleagues, I'm going to put Ngugi in there. My students, so that they don't get around it, for the exam, they must pick 3 African intellectuals. 3. Of all the intellectuals, whether it's Nontsizi Ngweto, or Philip Ndandala, or Gavin Mbeki, or Z.K. Matthews, or Saul Plaatje, or Michael Mafuze, I just asked them to pick 3 and write about their contributions to how black people have thought about society. And I've been doing this for the past 3 years, and I say to my colleagues, it's not very difficult to decolonize the curriculum. You just have to incorporate the material that is there and put it in the curriculum. And we all owe it to ourselves to do that. I know it's very easy for us to say, which I've been doing for a long time, that the whites are racist and they don't want to include but why can't we just put it there? We must do the work. And this is now my challenge to the students. That as in all of our social movements, as in all of our political movements, as in all of our liberation movements in the past, there was always a moment when the question was raised, what do we do? We've raised the issues, we've theorized the issues, we've put the issues on the table. But as Steve Biko said, after forming Black Consciousness and philosophizing about it for a long time, and then this famous sentence, where do we go from here? And so the idea behind these lectures was that we should invite a number of scholars from around the world to come and engage us, to come and engage the students, to honor the students for what they've been doing. Because quite frankly, that has been the role of students throughout history. Societies have changed because of students. Whether you go to 12th century Paris, or you go to France in the 1960s, or the United States in the 1970s with Black Studies programs, it's always been students at the forefront of social change. But each student generation has had to confront this question of what do we do from here? And so for me, it's fine to toy. But other than toy, I want somebody to say, I'm going to write a biography of Ngugi. And Ngugi came here in 2003 to give the Steve Biko Memorial Lecture at the University of Cape Town. And guess what his lecture was? It was on SEK Ngugi. It was a masterful rendition, which is contained in one of his books, Something New and Tall.
Something tall
and new.
Or remembering now.
Oh, remembering. There's a masterful piece on the life of SEK Ngugi. I had a student at UCT about 3 years ago, a white student who came to me and said, Prof, I want to study with you. I said, okay, Jonathan, what do you want to study? Right, young man. He said, you know what, I want to be in this thing that you're doing. I said, okay. I want you to write your thesis on the sociological imagination of S.E.K. Ngugi. He said, what? Who's there? So I called one of the people who work at UCT. I just said, that your mother Ngugi, and the gentleman went on about Ngugi. I said, you see, Jonathan, this is common knowledge. It's very important that in the academy, you learn about this. Yeah, Prof, but Ngugi wrote only in the course. I said, you see, this is one of the challenges for decolonizing the university, which Ngugi is going to talk about. How do we deal with these questions of language? But to cut a long story short, Jonathan did his thesis on S.E.K. Ngugi. He looked at Ngugi's poetry and, the translated stuff, because he couldn't really do the Xhosa. And he did Ngugi's biographies, he did Ngugi's journalism. At the end of the day, he produced a dissertation, a master's dissertation titled The Sociological Imagination of S.E.K. Ngugi. And on the basis of that dissertation, he got admitted for a PhD program at the University of Chicago. I am saying that whether it's Harvard University or Chicago or whatever, but also actually our own institutions, we need to build, this is our goal. This is our competitive advantage. Nobody can be better on this than us. Harvard cannot be better on this than us. We can be the best institute in the world on this. Just think about it for a second. We can be ranked #1 in the world on African intellectual history. Because we are it. Other people would have to come and study it. So why don't we do it? So I'm going to end with that challenge, which, by the way, could be the intellectual agenda for the next 25 years, at least. Writing all these biographies and all this history. I have known Ngugi Thiong'o for the past, since 2003. And I remember the first email conversation. I was working for the Steve Biko Foundation. And I'm an ambitious man. So I said to Njabulo Ndebele, who was then Vice Chancellor, I said, Prof, we've just started this foundation. I want to give it a little bit of a, profile. I have this idea of a Steve Biko Memorial Lecture, which would be an annual lecture that would be held at UCT by the best African scholars in the world. And Njabulo, like Sarah and Musweza, smelled the idea and just thought to give institutional support. And of course, the first person we invited was Chinua Achebe. If you remember, Chinua Achebe came here in 2002 to give the Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. And then I said, let me try and find Ngugi Thiong'o. Where is he? Somebody said, he's at the University of California at Irvine. I said, okay, I need to find, and I did my research, and I sent an email, and Ngugi sent me a one line which I'll never forget. He said, well, you got me there. If Achebe could come, why can't I come? Because Achebe, Ngugi, Soyinka, these are the titans of African literature. Inkonde zethu in our presence. Inkonde zethu that we need to honor, not ngokuthetha nje, but through our scholarship. And as I said earlier on, Ngugi came and spoke about Ngugi under the flag of Steve Biko, which is a very symbolic act in its own right. So we sat together with the National Institute for the Humanities and the Social Sciences, and I had these names. I said, folks, okay, what about this? And we went back and forth. I've been talking to Ngugi for a long time about who better to ask to talk about decolonization than the father of decolonization himself. right? I know people like to go to Fanon, I know people like to go elsewhere, but the man who's really actually the founder of decolonization on the African continent is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And you will know his essay, his revolutionary essay on the abolition of the English department. And that department in 1968, Ngugi and his colleagues wrote a memorandum to the university. Why should we have a department of English? We are in Africa. Why can't we have a department of literature? Where the literatures of the world can communicate with each other, not in a hierarchy, but in a relational network. And that act changed the face of African literature as we study it today. So, Ngugi, we're really honored and privileged and thankful. It's a long flight from California to here. 2 nights traveling so that you can be with us. The most revered scholar on the African continent gets on the plane and says, what is happening there is important enough for me to take time off between my classes. The reason, by the way, this program has been so packed is that Ngugi is teaching. So he has to do this between classes. And it's a great honor to us for him to have actually done that. I was at the University of California the other day, and they said, "You getting Ngugi?" And I said, "Yes." They said, "You know, he's an hour away from us, from LA. We've been trying to get him for the past 3 years." So without further ado, I'm going to ask Ngugi, the lion of African literature, to share his ideas with us. There's a map that, I don't know how the technology works. There's a map that's going to be projected. Khotso, where are you when I need you? Otherwise, I'm going to extemporate. Oh, is it here? Okay. I must say that while he's busy working on this, that one of the ideas that Ngugi and I have been talking about over the past few days is the idea that he's working on.
I'm very close to the center of gravity. So I'm stable. I'm so stable. But at the same time, sometimes when you put the mic higher, I have a little problem because of being closer to the center of gravity. But as I said, a good problem to have. I'll start with literally talking to the Deputy Minister of Finance. Okay, where is he? Or the Deputy Minister of Money. And I'll tell you why. I know I've been here before, and so I was really keen to come back to this part of the world, particularly Fort Hare and its extensions. And then there was a moment when you came when I thought I was in a kind of dream, kind of nightmare, mix of a dream. Not that we can have dreams in daytime instead of at night. Or one of the mysteries where you go through one corner, you imagine another area, in an area forested with whatever. Right. And that's what happened to me today. So let me start by that story. Because suddenly I found myself on Fleet Street. Then I went sort of, before figuring out where I was, I saw Oxford Street. Wow. Am I in? Okay, I think there was also Cambridge, I think. And I was, oh, and of course, I think Holland reminded me that this is where in East London. So I said, do they speak Cockney here? Right? It's really a kind of nightmare. And I think that I'm speaking to you, sir, really, honestly, we have to do something about that. Let them have their London, their free street. There's nothing wrong with that. But then let us have our cities. And if you guys think of a name, I'll give it. Call it Ngugi City. Or any other name that fits the personality of this area. Okay? So, we shall put Fleet Street, Oxford, Cambridge, and then in a big, nice envelope. And right there, return to sender. I'm also a little bit to Vice Chancellor Sakela Lungu. It's really wonderful for me to be here addressing all this gathering on Fort Hare. Fort Hare, Corella has already said it. I will really emphasize how important this institution is in the intellectual history of the continent. I might even go further and say in the political history of the continent. If I just say, I think I said before, on African Union, this should be a heritage for the entire continent. Remember, there was a time when emerging African intellectuals from the continent found a home for higher learning, and that was Fort Hare. From Kenya, from Zimbabwe, Mugabe, of course, I graduated Fort Hare, for instance. Our first Attorney General was graduate of Fort Hare, and many others who came from every part of the continent, because this was the institution that could recognize them as African scholars. Okay, it gave them a chance. It gave us a chance. It actually ignited our dreams. I know, for instance, one of the sons of my neighbor landlord in Kenya came to Fort Hare, and he was the talk of the entire region. And I was a child at the time, and he had this dream that maybe I too will one day be able to go to Fort Hare. Now, I did actually come to Fort Hare some years ago, but not as a student, but as a visitor, and said the same thing. So let's echo in action Helena's words which were good. So, I don't see you so passionate recently. That was a passionate call for decolonization, practically. And so we're talking about recognizing our own, building on our own, and creating. We do not want to be the best of Harvard or the best of Stanford. We want to be the best of ourselves. there is no originality in mimicry. Okay? Yeah. But when you're your own, then you can learn, from others. We can learn from Harvard, from Stanford, from Oxford, but on the basis of mutual exchange of ideas and aspirations, not on the basis of mimicry. Want to be an Oxford in Africa. Let Oxford be in England, okay? Nothing wrong with that. But let's also have our Fort Hare and so on in Africa. So I support that. I also want to recognize my appreciation to the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I was very, very impressed by, she's not here, but the director of the institute, Sarah Makwesa. She's a no-nonsense person. She goes straight to the heart of the matter, and she's so organized in her way she puts things and so on. She really impressed me, but I've also been very, very well received by the staff from the institute who have been taking care of my everything, including when I see that maybe I've got a gloomy face and so on, there is a lady, Keke, what is she? Keke, who has a way of saying something lightheartedly that cheers me up. Like today, when she thought that at least she was sort of a bit tired, so she asked me for my passport. I said, don't worry, I'll go there and present myself as you. the young you. And I put a smile on my face. Then there is also Thiong'o, whose name I'll declare to master, but today I was able to do it. Thiong'o, because what is Thiong'o? Yeah, because Thiong'o means actually rhino in the Kikuyu language. So I've been a rhino, I've been having a rhino. And he's so mindful. But whenever in my hotel, he says, can I have your key? I packed everything. You can't run it. Can I have a key to your room before you return it? I said, oh, my key? Yes, I want to go and see whether you've left anything behind. And he'll be very conscious, so very touching, quite frankly. And I really say thank you to both of you. Now, I'm also to do another secret here, and this is in connection. Why is the former Vice Chancellor of Sisulu University, Professor Balintula? Yeah, he is here. You know this by boss, I'll tell you why. Did you know that I'm an alumni of Sisulu University? I'm an alumni. Sisulu University, in its previous incarnation, was the first, I believe, first African university or any university on the continent to award me an honorary doctorate of literature. And I appreciated it because my previous 8 or 9, I think 8 doctors had come from all over the world, from Denmark to New Zealand, I don't know where else, and so on, but none from Africa. So I was feeling, so this was restoring a sense of how it should be, from Africa to the world, not the world into Africa. We can from Africa to the world, and then the world can come to us, but not a sense of always being beholden. And although I appreciate those honorary doctorates, but really this one struck home. And they ignite the Salam University later to give me another honor doctorate. And even then, when I was getting that one, I had to mention that Walter Sisulu was the first on the continent. And then, okay, this is important. When, and it was embarrassing for me as a Kenyan, because I'm very proud of my country, Kenya. But at the same time, it was tragically, after that reception in South Africa and all the great things we got here, and so, I don't know whether that was time, but I know, that when my wife and kids got back to my home country, Kenya, we were attacked by 4 armed gunmen, and we barely escaped with our lives. So there was this glory from South Africa. Then I go to my own home and I get that kind of reception, although the people of Kenya themselves were really, sort of could feel they were really with us, and I've always appreciated that. But last year, I was back in Kenya to get an honorary doctorate from a Kenyan institution. So you see, what you started is being followed by others on the continent. And I dare say that this time, and even previously went to Kenya, I've now been received by the head of state, me and my family, and he has invited to Kenya 2 times. It's a very different state of affairs from the one prevailing in those years when we barely escaped with our lives. Now, so thank you very much for that honor you gave me. So I proudly always say I'm an alumni of Walter Sisulu University. And of course the name itself, wow, you know that it's only goes there, but I think when you talk about our countries, this being the center of learning, it's so we can also learn about, people, intellectuals, and political activists too, and like Walter Sisulu, and his wife and others. I mean, there's a whole, well, we shall come to that in a minute. Yeah. So, but before we come to the few comments that I've made, I want to simply draw my attention to one, the map on the wall. You see the map there? Can you look at it carefully? It's okay. I have a magic pointer. Oh, is that pen?
No, it's a
Oh. Oh, wow. Okay. This is magic. This side is a pen, and this side is a pointer. Oh. Yeah, I just want us to look at this map very carefully because it really forms the background of my talk. So that when I'm talking, you become aware of this map. When I was growing up, the maps which we looked at the time always made Europe look as if it was bigger than Africa all the time. And that's how I grew up thinking that Europe was bigger. And it was bigger indeed because it was ruling over us all over the world, right? So it was really bigger also in reality. And then you look at this map and others which show the true size of Africa in relation to other countries. Look at this. This is America. It's just a region within Africa. America. right? Look at the other giant today. China is a province in Africa. Look at India, another province in Africa. Now, where is Europe? I think these pieces form, Europe. Yeah, okay. Japan. And I think there's room for some more. The only one that's quite big, we don't have it here, is Australia. Right? Two things we can say about this. First, maps also lied to us. That's all. They were colonial maps. They were part of colonizing this nation of the mind. Because you look at the map and you start by assuming a very false visual and physical and spatial relationship between Africa and Europe. Okay. Secondly, if Africa is the biggest continent in the world, surely it follows that it's likely also to be the one which has majority of resources in the world, right? So, first of all, there are two things. How come some islands, which are not even visible within the region, like France? I think France would be a province of Nigeria somewhere. You look for England here, I don't even know where it is. Get a telescope or something, or magnify to see it, okay? But how come that those islands came to rule over this whole continent? How did that happen? Okay. Also, how come that this continent, with all those resources, is also the poorest continent vis-a-vis the others? How does that happen? Really? We produce gold, diamonds, we produce oil everywhere, and other things, copper. Even the making of these seraphones would be impossible without the mineral from the Congo, right? Even nuclear weapons, the uranium comes from Nigeria, right? Right? We will support, that's a very proud thing to do, say, but we also got uranium. Okay. But the fact is, the West, and Europe in particular, uses 90% of our resources. Right? Then comes another fiction. Every time we are told that it's Europe which gives us aid. Right? Everywhere. We give South Africa so much aid, we give Kenya so much aid. That's another lie. It's Africa which has been donating to the West. Africa has been, is, and continues to be the eternal donor to the West. Right? In fact, you look at, there will be no history of modern capitalism without, say, for instance, this trade in African bodies, right? And South Africa is important in that respect. We shall come to that. So, but I've said enough for you to see why I think this map is central to the whole idea of decolonization of the mind. Because it's not that we lack bravery, because during the Second World War, for instance, or those conscripted African soldiers helped Europe liberate itself from Hitler. African soldiers were all over in Burma and in Palestine, they were there, they marched other places and so on. But today, you can see the unequal balance of power between Africa by asking ourselves two questions. First, some of you have been to London, and I don't mean the fake East London. Because that fake London is not, that other place has its own real name, okay? Has its real name, okay? But if you go to that other London, the original London, Auckland, you will not find an African-owned company drilling oil in the shores of England or America or anywhere in Europe. At least I have not found one. I have not seen an African-owned bank or banks or insurance companies in London, Paris, or New York. Okay, you could go on and on. Okay, not seen one. On the military front, you've heard of joint military exercises between European Western forces and African military. Have you heard of that? Yeah, joint military exercises, even here, okay? But and tell me if I'm wrong here, I've never come across a statement indicating that there has ever been any joint military exercises between African troops and Europe, on European soil. It's always joint military exercises between Europe and on African soil, right? Europe has problems, even America has problems. America, by the way, has 3 million people in prison, 3 million people in prison, okay? There are good things, but there are problems. But have you ever heard of any military intervention from Africa in any part of Europe or America? Yeah. But the other way around is, well, common phenomenon. All these things, by the way, have to do, we are brave, we fought, whenever we were united, we were able to. Africa has been able to do great things, by the way. I don't deny what we have done. No other country has had to go through 300 years of its people enslaved, by the way, because of being uprooted from the continent, the most able, the most was being uprooted and sold to another continent. So Africa has gone through slave period, through colonial period. In some ways, it's a miracle that we have survived. But we can't be satisfied with mere survival. We must make things. We must realize we are strongest, most powerful when we are united, when we rely on ourselves. That strength which is within us. And this is really going to be my talk today, or I'll focus mainly on the language issue. Because in the end, if we are brave, if I do all those things, if when commanded by the officers, we go and fight wars everywhere, what then makes us, our continent, be that all the resources are controlled from elsewhere. Because of the colony of the mind, right? Colony of the mind. And that's a battle which we still have to fight, because the remnants can be very, very dangerous as well as normalized, and I'll show you the reason why it begins with language. However, since I'm here in South Africa, and we will talk about this intellectual tradition that South Africa has produced, continuous intellectual production from 19th century, literally, to the present. I want to think of talking about one such South African intellectual who died on 18th January this year. Yeah. He died at his home in Jamaica. I believe he was 97, 3 years shy of making a century of a literary life that produced such classics of African literature as, we mentioned a few, Mind Boy, 1946, although even before that, 1942, he produced another novel, 1942, in English. And Mind Boy was among the first works to dramatize the plight of black mine workers in South Africa. He also wrote Part of Thunder, among the first to dramatize the politics of interracial marriages. And this, remember, came out in 1948, the year of the African ascendancy in South African politics. And they are making apartheid part of the fundamental of the land, center of the Constitution. He also published Wild Conquest in 1953, which dramatized the Boer trek into the interior and the dispossession of the African people along the way. In fact, it is called dispossessed. You are telling me something about dispossessed.
The wars of dispossession.
Yeah, he gave me a new terminology. We are coming. Now we call them the wars of dispossession. The Great Trek actually was such a trek into consolidation of this dispossession that began way back in the Cape and so on. I'm talking of Peter Abrahams. He, the first International Congress of Africanists in Accra, which actually is instructive in its contemporary relevance. His speech carried the hope that the Congress would be a major step towards an Africa-centered view of itself, its history and culture. For him, the knowledge existing in African languages was an important starting point in our intellectual journey in Africa and the world. He called for the sharing of experiences contained in our different languages as part of our common endeavor of presenting our history as a history of an African people and not a history written by Europeans about an African people. He came to the same thing when a year later he gave another speech at the opening of the Institute of African Studies, among them. I think it was the first in Africa, I believe, where he talked about the study of African history, culture, institutions, languages, and art as necessary in the African self-imagination, in launching itself into modernity. For him, a study and development of African languages was not a side issue. It's not like, oh, it's not to say one or two proverbs in African languages. or to swear, one or two words, or to make a little joke, or sometimes, well, other things we do that in languages when we are not very serious, really. But when we are serious, of course, we come to English and French and so on. African languages were central in African scholarship, development, and its relationship to the diaspora and the world. Now, this is very important that he did not call for linguistic self-isolation, for he saw the role of other languages like Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese. But clearly for him, African languages were not a lower rung on the ladder to an English heaven, but rather an equal partner in the construction of a common heaven. It's fair, therefore, to pause and ask, after 50 years of, say, independence, for the continent, have we regained the cultural and intellectual independence that we had lost to colonialism? And once again, let me just pause on the idea of losing some to colonialism. Because something we forget, there was an Africa before colonialism. Right. There was an Africa of Egypt, which is the longest surviving civilization of 3,000 years. Right? There was civilization in the whole area, which is Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Right? There was that. But they said, oh, Egypt not really an African country. Oh, where did they come from, those people? Someone they disappeared, or something happened to them. But yeah, okay. Great Zimbabwe, actually, I remember this very interesting. Great Zimbabwe, with one of the constructions they have there. They used to argue, and books were written to show, to prove that actually it was built I think Portuguese, who somehow, because they're not similar structures, so these Portuguese were somehow flew over from the coast, went to the harbor, built this structure, and somehow disappeared, right? Anything and everything except saying that African people did that, okay? So the case lost to colonialism. There was an Africa before colonialism. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that in terms of quantity and quality of scholarly production, African scholarship and general scholarship on Africa is a far, far cry from that prevailing in the days of that Kwame Nkrumah spoke about the situation. Hegelian Africa, enveloped in the dark mantle of the night, and that of Treveropa, for whom the continent had only darkness to exhibit, and darkness not be the subject of history. Africa is gone forever. Thanks to this scholarship. Let me pause again there. I don't know how much, people know about this Hegel. Hegel is a very important philosopher, and in many ways he has very, very good ideas. But he also wrote a book on the history of philosophy. And for him, philosophy, history was actually embodiment of reason and freedom. Even, like we say, God, like manifesting himself in history. So God as reason, as freedom. And he said, history traveled from east to the west. And by the way, it bypassed Africa. Then he said Africa was a land of childhood, still enveloped in a dark mantle of the night. very powerful image of an Africa asleep, and this Africa would occasionally open his mouth and a fruit would fall from a tree and then go back to sleep. Right? That was again Africa. So that's the Africa of missionaries and other people who followed. But despite this, so much which we have done, all of us in South Africa, in Kenya, all of Africa, have we fulfilled the Nkrumah's vision? And here we have to look at ourselves very close and critically. You know, we have to kind of be truthful to ourselves. Because unfortunately, African scholarship has achieved this great visibility in the world by the tremendous feat of making itself invisible to Africa. African scholarship wears a linguistic mask with the magic quality of making it invisible to the majority in the continent. And by the way, and spontaneously visible to those with a key made in Europe. Right? The keys are placed labeled. Actually, I think about 4 or 5 keys. One key is labeled English, the other key French, the other key Portuguese. With those keys, you can open African scholarship, right? And get something. But without those keys, that thing we call African scholarship is suddenly invisible to the majority of African people. Thus, we arrive at a position that is the opposite of that invasion in Kwame Nkrumah's speeches. We can only see ourselves through European eyes at the minimum. This makes us look at Africa with the eyes of an outsider, thus in effect giving up on our responsibility to secure the continent for African people. In the same speech, Nkrumah posed a question: are we really sure that our students are in touch with the life of the nation? Perhaps here we can rephrase the question: are we sure that after 50 years of modern African scholarship, we are in touch with the nation, with the continent, with the African peoples? Or more basic and consequential, is the independent African state now in existence for the same 50 years or more in touch with its own people? Or does the state continue to look at Africa as with the eyes of the outsider? And I say, how can it be in touch when it has embraced European languages spoken and used by only 10% of the population as the languages of power, commerce, education, of law and justice? Think about it for a moment. Just affects everybody. Does not affect only people with PhDs or who speak English and so on. And I know about South Africa, but in many court systems in Africa, Kenya in particular, the whole business conducted, in English. Defense lawyer, prosecuting lawyer, the judges, and when African peasant is brought to the court through for whatever reason, they have to depend on an interpreter, right? Yeah, and that's okay. So the fact is, in any independent African nation today, the majority are rendered linguistically deaf and mute by government policies that have set European languages as the normative measure of worth in every aspect of national life. Now, this, and I can't overemphasize this, this situation is not a consequence of an accident of history. It's not an accident, right? It is the fulfillment of a conscious imperial design in the long history of conquest. And so I want, indulge me if I move from Africa for a while and use examples from other countries. In fact, I'll start with a European country, Ireland. You know Ireland? Yeah, it's another island, which is next to another island. They're next to each other, okay? But that island was actually the first colony of what was first English colony. So, let us take the example of Ireland. Ireland, England's first colony, was a historical nursery of patterns of power relations that would be reproduced in Asia and Africa. Among these is power relationship, or an equal power relationship between the language of the conqueror and the language of the vanquished. I want to do a little history, at the very early stage of the settlement of Ireland by English settlers. Following the Anglo-Norman conquest and settlement of Ireland, London enacted several acts aimed at protecting English language against the subversive encroachment of Irish or Gaelic, a language that then had a much richer history of intellectual production than, say, English or French. Among other penalties, the 1366 Statute of Kilkenny threatened to confiscate any lands of any English or any Irish living among them who would use, and I quote from the edict, would use Irish among themselves, contrary to the ordinance. But even English, even court-speaking Irish, were subject to the laws of the land they had already confiscated from the Irish. By the 16th century, the ordinance had of course failed to achieve their desired end, and that is the subjugation of the Irish. So enter a very important character. His name is Edmund Spenser. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. And he wrote such works as Fairy Queen and Shepherd's Calendar. But more important for our discussion today, he was a settler planter in Munster, Ireland. In 1598, Spenser published his famous book, A View of Ireland at the Present Time, a dialogic manifesto on how to tame the Irish through the erasure of their memory. I need to put this context a little bit. The book is a dialogue between an English settler in Ireland, Munster, Ireland, and a visiting lord from London. And this lord is asking, how come you not managed to tame the Irish? Why? Right? You come to a solution, my friends. We can only erase their memory through naming. Yes, names and language were the suggested instruments to that end. For, as one of the speak interlocutors in a dialogue says, and I quote from the book, it has ever been the use of the conqueror to despise the language of the conquered and force him, the conquered, by all means to learn his. Right? This was revolutionary. The book and the sentiment are significant because they come at a time when the nascent European nation states have emerged from linguistic hegemony of Latin and the religious hegemony of the Catholic Church. Tribal nationalism are on the rise, and mercantile capitalism is turning imperial and colonial, with the black body at the center of the emerging commerce. And South Africa is right there at the center of the beginning of modern capitalism. Right? And you know how. You know a character in history called Vasco da Gama? Huh? I think he was a Portuguese, or he was employed by the Portuguese, or he was a mercenary, well, okay. Anyway, he was employed by the Portuguese, okay? And in 1498, correct, Ali, he landed at the Cape, what's called the Cape of Good Hope. And that was a mark of a new journey altogether, not only in Africa, but in the world. Because in some ways, this was the beginning of that mercantile capitalism, which was a precursor to industrial capitalism and the whole globalization thing today, you know, that's what's not. And the center of that mercantile is the enslavement of the African body turned into a commodity. Okay? So South Africa is there in the mix. And remember that all it follows Europe's discovery of America and the sea route to India via South Africa, events that Adam Smith, the writer of World of Nations, who later described as revolutionary in their impact on the modern. Even he that was understood at that journey through South Africa was revolutionary everything, right? Marx was kind of the same thing, you know, about the role of South Africa and also the slavery of that followed in the creation of the modern industrial European nation. So I'm not sure really what gave rise to the other, but nationalism, mercantile capitalism, and colonial expansion fed into each other, and they all end in African enslavement. Now I bring another character. You know, I'm a fiction writer, but these are historical characters, by the way. They're not fiction, I will are fiction. Now, when you go back to Somalia, this is actually very interesting. So, let's see this picture. Here is Edmund Spencer, English boy, but also a settler. And of course, you know about settlers. Here, South Africa, he's a settler. Next to him is another character, a very interesting character. His name is Walter Raleigh. Okay? I don't know whether you heard of Walter Raleigh, but when I was learning English history, he was a very important character in those times. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Walter Raleigh was Spencer's settler neighbor in Munster. And he, Walter Raleigh, would go on to found Virginia, the first truly English colony in the Americas. In the American slave plantations that followed the settlements, African languages, including the drum, that is the talking drum, would later be banned. Some of those breaking the ban even earning the noose around their necks. So the first martyrs for African languages were the diasporic African. You must remember that. But that's not a story. I won't go into it too much. Though I have not come across evidence of actual banning of African languages on the continent, but each of the post-Berlin colonizing nations put their languages at the center of their imperial universe. Each one of them. You know, the French colony, they didn't teach English, so you teach English, you know, teach French, but no. English, French became the language of power in each of their territories. So I want to, once again, we're talking about imperial all the time, for a reason. Because I want to emphasize that this is a colonial phenomenon, a question of power and equal power relation, or not. Now I want to emphasize this in South Africa, and not a black and white issue. Because I'm going to give another example. Imperial Japan, when in 1910 it annexed Korea, they made Koreans take on Japanese names and language. A policy reversed only after the defeat of Japanese colonialism in the Second World War. Once again, the defeat by the help by African soldiers. We always everywhere doing this for other people, correct? When the USA annexed Hawaii, early 20th century, the banned the use of Hawaiian language until 1978, right? In all such cases of colonial conquest, language was meant to complete what the sword had started. Do to the mind what the sword had done to the body. And actually, before I came, I came traveling at night because I was teaching a class actually on Tuesday. But I had invited a guest who was on a class I called Uniformism and Postcolonialism. I invited someone to talk about the Native American case. You know? And she told us some harrowing narratives. I don't even want to repeat it, but let me just say this. She read and told us of some harrowing narratives of how Native American children were snatched from their community and put into boarding schools where they were given European names and then immersed in English. There's one drama case where taken from wherever their brothers were told, now we shall give you English names. Again, question of names. I mean, so all of us who that carry those, you must know this about history, right? There was one time when they had to have them, these English names. Now remember, there's nothing wrong with the English name for the English, obviously. But equally well, there's nothing wrong for the Zulu name for the Zulu people, right? Right? Yeah. Anyway. But recently, in my class also, we read another article by one called Adam Beach, B-E-A-C-H, who has argued that even the 18th century struggles for the standardization of English had both a national and imperial intent. A standardized English would become the building block of a metaphysical empire. An empire of language and literature that could outlive the actual British physical empire. So it were foreseeing such a possibility. If you can take colonies of the mind, they can actually outlive the physical colonies of the economy and politics, right? Now, was this just a fantasy? Okay, let's go to India, right? 19th century. This policy was actually put into practical language politics in 19th century India, where in a famous Minutes on Indian Education in 1934, Macaulay advocated English as a medium of education in India in order to create a class of people, Indian in blood and color, but otherwise English in mentality and everything else. He was very honest. He didn't sort of masquerade and say, won't get at their minds. And why? Because the Indian people, there are a long history of writing Sanskrit. The Ramayana, which I'm reading right now, and the Mahabharata, written 9 centuries before before the Christian era, okay? And in 1994 is also important because it's also the year of what used to be called the Indian Mutiny against British, corporate rule in India. So, I mean, if Indian people were rising hard, what Macaulay comes says, no more of teaching education through Sanskrit or any other. It has been done in English as a center. The same was happening in those spheres under other European powers. The French and the Portuguese called their version of the Macaulayan process assimilation. Language was a key factor in assimilation. But my friend, neither the French and the Portuguese, or for that matter the British, went through the exercise for the aesthetics of assimilation. Believe me, the Portuguese were not saying, sitting at the table saying, oh my God, it's so beautiful to assimilate these people. Oh, assimilation, look at these assimilated people, how beautiful. There was no aesthetics about it, yeah. So they did not go through this for the aesthetics of assimilation. As Macaulay himself put it bluntly, it was to create a linguistically westernized middleman who would automatically carry out the intent of the ruler or the masses. They rule, create an English-speaking middle class, so that kind of buffer zone to be the one through which the British could exercise their rule without fear of armed struggle. Because we can get the mind why worry about what they might do, right? In the case of the French, of their accents, Africa gave Europe access to the resources of the continent. So when African intellectuals and leadership were busy perfecting their borrowed accents, make sure it's perfect, Europe and the West were busy sharpening their instruments for access to the resources of the continent. Right? Accents for access. That, unfortunately, is a story of post-colonial Africa. And you can tell this, you want to get by the budgets. Hello, please. I think you can tell us the truth. Or in fact, that's why I think I'm the one who secretly engineered that you be invited. Kind of, that's magically. Anyway, because in every other country, if you look at the budget and the money allotted for education, quite a big in budget terms, But a portion of education that goes for languages, the majority of that goes to the development of English and European languages. The portion of that goes to African languages is very minuscule, where in South Africa it's great because we have an 8-language policy or 9-language policy. It's very, very good, Although I think financial muscle should put into it, not as a side issue, as some kind of token thing, but really as necessary for the South African personality. Really. So, has the metaphysical empire, or the empire of the mind, outlived the physical empire as envisioned by the advocates of the language spread? The success of the empires of the mind, or colonies of the mind, can be seen in the very defenders of the dominance of European languages over those of areas and regions outside Europe. Today, the defense does not necessarily come from its exporters, but rather from the importers. In Africa today, the defenders are African intellectuals and policy makers. Some of them act as if it is the English and European languages whose existence is being threatened by African languages. You know, some even say, see, African languages interfere with English, the English accent. So it's like leaving your house burning and you go to rescue, or an imagined fire from or the other house. You know, African languages interfere on that accent. Again, I want to say outside Africa, so it's not just an African or black-white issue, because it's not unique or new to Africa. The defenders of English and arguments in favor of its dominance come from the intellectuals of the colonized periphery as a whole. In the case of the English, this phenomenon first manifested itself in England's northern neighbor, Scotland. The eminent intellectuals of the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment, you know, thinkers like Hume or Smith, whom I've already mentioned, and others, Boswell, who wrote the biography of Johnson and all that, waxed ecstatic about the standardization of English and its virtues for national formation and even as an imperial export. But even among the Irish, the great defenders of the language were latter-day Irish intellectuals. Now, again, I want to emphasize there's nothing wrong if you want to take English as a personal choice or any other language of one's own. It is a personal choice you are making, not a national choice made by your government or by a previous government. Okay? I've always argued that each language, big or small, has its unique musicality. That there is no language whose musicality and cognitive potential is inherently better than another. No language. African languages, with all their different and unique musicality, are still in everyday use, actually. Because when I was coming to Johannesburg, actually, which I have another relation to Johannesburg, which I'm going to, because I think when I first came to South Africa, I was flying to Lesotho as an external examiner, and they only let me out into the country. Right? So I sleep at an airport hotel, which is in Johannesburg. And then they would allow me to drive across the territory. I had to fly, okay, over. Now this is when I came along, they were fighting these black, sort of American officers. And I'm always, I must say, as an African person, I'm always touched whenever I go and I've had African people in such positions, quite frankly. But these guys were also very interesting, where they were talking in Zulu to each other, and they were not apologizing, and one of them was even singing. So I asked him, oh, you are a singer. He was coming, and then he sang more. And so I was welcome with us. He was welcome, but he was very good, and I liked that. Very different from the other days. So, African languages, with all their unique musicalities, are still in everyday use. What seems to horrify these intellectuals and policymakers is and the international service behind them is a call for a vigorous, literary, intellectual, and even scholarly reflection of that reality. Availability of more information, more knowledge, more skills in those languages, otherwise in their use, according to break up the nation. Problem. You see, the problem of African unity is that there are too many African languages. The problem with national unity is, these Africans, they are very busy talking their own languages, right? So what's the best language of unity of a nation? Get English or French, spoken by only 10%. It's unified. We are a nation because we speak English, all of that. It's like concentration of the same in English or French will somehow cement the nation. The result is pamper European languages, pauperize African languages. The entire African language speaking majorities are taxed directly or indirectly. So 90% of the resources available for language education can go to English accents. In some African countries, African languages have been unceremoniously axed out of the curriculum or made into electives. Some advocates of English dominance not only want it to be so, but would actually like to see the literary disappearance of native languages altogether. Let them become language of proverbs and jokes, right? And humor, of course. Now, this is very serious, my friend, because the explanation of this desire, the wish for one's own language, and its simultaneous categorical embrace of the dominant other has to go beyond the usage or not of the language in question. It lies in how that sense of dominance was brought about. I'll pause a little bit, because what I'm going to say is I was so serious. I don't want to think about serious, but I want to say, even when we embrace these languages as they are language of unity, how do they describe blackness? Not that we are all black, instead of me, we have various colors, and some of saying we should not be using the word black because we are different. But I like using it because it was the phrase of our inauguration, like affirming, no, I'm black and proud of it. I don't want to change my hair, although I can do it a few. Oh, but however, were you a witness that actually I comb my hair?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah? I've had this problem in my hair all my life. I comb very religiously in the morning. When I go to school, they punish me for not combing my hair. Right? But at the same time, at least, the others who change their hair, they have it, even in Africa, there are people who go and buy dead people's hair. Dead people's hair, right? Yeah. From Brazil or some other place, I don't know. Right? And you don't understand why sometimes they are sleepless at night because the ghosts. But seriously, the other thing is when it comes to languages. In all languages, sometimes have negative, even after languages have negative vocabulary for other people, by the way. But for the English language, let's play around with this, Black market, blacklist, Black Friday on it, financial say forever, broken down. Black sheep of the family, black this, black that, English lies, right? Or rather white lies, actually. Other terms like, have you ever understood why we call ourselves tribesmen? Very easy. I know this in Kenya. I'll say, whether I'm a Gikuyu by tribe. And then I introduce my friend here, he said, it's caused by tribe. Right? Tribe. Question is this. Iceland is on 250,000 people. 250,000. Yorubas alone in Nigeria are 40 million. How come that 40 million people are a tribe and 250,000 people are a nation? Right? Yeah. So I've come with a simple solution for all these things. Sometimes we call English the English or the English people, the French or the French people, the Chinese or the Chinese people, the same for Japanese, Russian, and so on. So I'm saying, let's do the same for other peoples. Please call people by the name with which they identify themselves. If you are Zulu and proud of it, not a Zulu tribesman. You might call a Mohikuyu or Haikuyu, not a Mohikuyu tribesman. And we must get rid of the business of describing African leaders in terms of the region they come from. And say he's this brother with a PhD from so many countries, and he's also a Mohikuyu tribesman. Really? And we do it. We can't normalize these things. Now, having sort of got rid of that little something, let me come to the more serious stuff. About the explanation of this design, which is double. One has dead wish for one's own language, and the other, the embrace of the other language as the most desirable vis-a-vis my own language, okay? And it probably lies the explanation of this desire, that wish for one's own language, and the spontaneous categorical embrace of the dominant other has to go beyond the uses or not of the languages in question. It probably lies in how the sense of dominance was brought about. Again, I may have to go outside Africa to get examples. A common thread in the export of English in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Africa, and Asia, was the constant association of extreme humiliation and negativity with native languages, and the corresponding value and prestige associated with English in colonial education factories. Corporal punishment, that is physical violence, was often meted to children caught speaking mother tongue in a school compound, and additionally made to perform acts of shame, like carrying objects that proclaimed their stupidity, or even made to swallow filth in some cases. So all this has been filth, some backward humiliation associated with one language. One set of languages was associated with defeat, shame, incoherence, savagery even, and the other with modernity, science, with human itself and conquest. No wonder people would want to bask in the sunshine of the languages of glory and hide from those of shame and defeat. Experiments have been done with rats, where an original group is subject to electrical shocks if they go to certain spaces, and rewarded if they take the desired space. After being conditioned, the rats would avoid the state of pain, although the first generation would be hesitant, and then they would remember and then move from a place of shame to a space of pleasure. But it was noted that the second, even that generation, did not have to be conditioned by electrical shocks. They automatically avoided space of pain and opted for those of pleasure. The same for humans. We avoid the space of pain and embrace those of pleasure. The key thing is that this may be passed on to the next generation, as in the case of the rest, who follow the space of pleasure, avoiding those of pain, without really knowing why. They do it, not automatic. And he just, why? What do you think? I sometimes say, for instance, in the case of English sounds would sound very profound. Why does English sound profound? English sound, oh, that's knowledge. Oh, that's science, technology. Oh, wonderful. And the other one says, oh, yeah, being musical is very interesting, but really, you know, actually science and technology and so on. Okay, you can do that any day. Meet one African who says, I know modern languages. I speak French and Italian and German and Russian, maybe, you know. And we say, my brother, now he's learning, isn't he? Right? Then another one comes and says, I too speak many languages. I speak Zulu, I speak Kikuyu, I speak Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, and oh. But why? Right? You know, this is because this thing is passed on. You actually, that really honestly, at some point, it's not even understand. When I even asking them, so why? It looks normal that if I want science and technology, I think of English. If I want jokes and proverbs, I think African, right? It becomes an inherited behavior and norm. But whatever the explanations, origins and the processes, the resulting empires of the mind still impact Africa and the developing world negatively in relation to corporate rule. Since the middle class in Africa talks and behaves as if its needs, its shopping habits, its goals, however self-serving, servile, and ultimately suicidal, are identical with the goals of the nation, so when they talk about the national and official languages, they always mean the languages spoken and understood by the schooled middle class. For them, the language inheritance from youth is doubly advantageous. For them, it unites the nation, meaning, of course, the top 10% in each of the linguistic communities. And most important, it links them to the global culture and lifestyle I share in the globalized world. An objection to African languages is based not only on the fear that it will disunite the nation, but it will hamper participation in a globalized world. English and European languages give them a seat, or us a seat at the global table. African languages tarnish their right to sit in the global table. We need a globe, we are told, and that globe can only hear us in English. The English accent blinds them to the reality that what they are getting from the global table are simply remnants of the global access to African resources. Corporate globe wants unfettered access to the vast resources of the continent. But because of the corner of the mind, we've been convinced of the opposite, that we who need a perfect English accent to access to reach the globe. If it had been left in the hands and minds of some of the policymakers or the former colonized, African languages would die, forever hidden in a crypt that can never be opened. Fortunately, even within the current tide of apparent defeat, resistance to the empire of the mind continues. For one, African languages have refused to die. They were meant to die, but they resisted these 300 years or so. They've been kept alive, vibrant by the peasantry and the urban mass, working people. Orality and spin-offs from it, that is orature, music and dance are still alive. In fact, even Europhone African literature constantly borrows from orality. Writing in African languages continues, but despite these efforts, it's the Europhone tradition that has the visibility nationally and globally. With Ngugi and others wrote in English. Even Peter Abrahams, who wrote in English, was more visible than Kinabirakal and others who are writing in African languages. Okay? Surely, universities like this one, as Fort Hare, which has this history, ought to be full of scholars who know and even work in several African languages. There should be translators in African languages, theories of African languages in African languages. Then we can share our finds in whatever languages we have in common, including English. That way, we shall be drawing from our strength a knowledge of more than our own, without that is a knowledge of more than our own, without abandoning our own. Says, use English instead of English using us. Right? Every African university should become an advocate of African languages. Press government to change their anti-African, slavish, suicidal linguistic policies. We should be making resolution after resolution calling upon each and every country to set up a well-funded and resourced National Bureau of African languages in their territories. And at each National Bureau, there will be constituent bureaus for each of the languages, however small. These bureaus would actively contribute to language policy and practice and come up with ways of effectively popularizing reading, writing, and scholarizing in African languages. We should work with popular performances. The various national bureaus would then become constituent members of a North-Africa Union or based Pan-African Bureau of African Languages, right? Use this architecture. Above all, make knowledge of an African language count in awarding degrees, in promotions at the university, civil service. Yeah. And even when we have people from outside And knowledge of the language should be one of the tests. You know what? If I went to Harvard and say, oh, I don't know English, it doesn't matter whether I know English or not, but I know a lot of Gikuyu, and I'm asking for a job at Harvard. They look at me, what? You don't know English? Which is only Gikuyu? And I say, yes, I know Gikuyu. Do I have to know English? We should really do the same. Using whatever resources we have to really unbalance this ridiculous situation we find ourselves in, and we can do it. So, a knowledge of an African language should be counted in evaluating teachers from abroad. Make it, or rather, let us make it both cool and clever to know an African language. This does not mean, and should never mean, and I emphasize this, it does not mean retreating into linguistic self-isolation. So I come to my other statement, please the President put me on this as well, to follow on the example of Holela. If you know all the languages of the world, and you don't know your mother tongue, or the language of your culture, that is enslavement. But if you know your mother tongue, or the languages of your culture, and add all the other languages of the world to it, that is empowerment. Sure. We want an Africa economically, politically, culturally, and psychologically empowered. An Africa secure in its base, even as it engages with other peoples and other continents. And you know what? We can do it.
Inganga yobun kholo khole bu khele obun kholo bozi kholo ezi kholo inganga yengondi ezingongwe zingondi ezinganga gobun ngode Asante mzee mkubwa, asante mwalimu, na batoto ba Afrika Kusini, na kupenda mzee mkubwa, na nzuri kabisa. Ni msundu gani msunduzwa, msundu zani, ni kupeke mwale kondweni, ni kupeke ni kopoke kondweni, ni nga kupeke ni kopoke kondweni. Ubukhobo kubuthutuzwe ubukhobo kubufifithuzwe ningamfaneki ngengqondo ngqondo ningamfaneki nivala amehlo lona metilizwe lingabe ingqanga ezikholeke engqondweni ndikanda ujika umbombo ndangena kumzi kaMthuma ndafika bengixesha ngesinqo siyaAfrika ndawujika umbombo ndakhoba kulolu mumba ndafika ulumba bemtshekeza ndawujika umbombo ndajonga lokusankara ndafika usankara bemqongqotha ndawujika umbombo ndajonga kumanqe Afrika ndafika betyikilana ngokujenga ngokudungu kudingidingi bekhwithana ngokuvunqela ziyatha ajongile kodwa bamfakele engqondweni balele kodwa bamfakele engqondweni lovuka naloo mntu unthunduze sithube ingqanga, sithube inkcubeko, sithube ulwazi, sithube ingqanga zeAfrika ezawukhonya
Not students. But I'm just putting it out there as an idea. And another thing that I wanted to take, is that, we tend to assume, for some reason, that the history of human beings is only 500 years. We tend to think the world, modernity, is what it has been over the past 500 years, which is a tiny, tiny drop in the history of humanity. I was at the British Museum the other day. My office is not far from there. And somebody called me. There is an exhibition, as I speak now, at the British Museum. And you have to go to Britain to get these things. That's another shame. But it's called 100,000 years of South African art. 100,000. They go back to the rock art paintings of the sun, but they go back as far as you can, and it's there. And as you go out of this section on South African art, there is 3,000 years of Greek, of Egyptian civilization. So people have spoken in many languages throughout history, but somehow we tend to think that what we have is the way it can only be. So sometimes it takes just a challenge to our own imagination. The resistance to Africa, I don't know how many people know about the Piltdown Man, the story of the Piltdown Man. The story of the Piltdown Man, basically a couple of European scientists in 1910 in Britain were so upset by the idea that human beings originated from Africa. They were so upset that they literally forged a skull, a fossil. They forged it, they put together a head and some jaws together, and they put that there and said, what those people in Africa are saying is false about human beings coming out of Africa. Human beings, they said, originated in Britain. And that became the theory in paleoanthropology between 1910 and 1950. That Europe had to turn on its head the notion that human beings came from Africa, until somebody actually did a physical examination of this fossil, and it was proven to be a fake. You can go Google it these days. It's called the Piltdown Man, right? So that's how much, attempts have been made to privilege civilizations over others, even to the extent of forging history. So that's why it's very important, it seems to me, that out of that, of course, this normality has been created, but it's a normality created on very false foundations. So that's why it seems to me that our duty as scholars is actually to elevate this 100,000 years of human achievement that has its origins here, and write about it and document it and have our students engage with it. All right? But it's my turn now to open it up for questions. And we'll take one question at a time, Ngugi? Or
Yeah,
one question at a time. Please make it brief so that we can get as many questions as possible. I think the easiest way for me to do this is to say, any hands in that section of the hall? Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Okay.
Is there a microphone?
My question for you, sir. You rightly point out that African literature itself has been made invisible to Africa. And one of the problems we have in the South African context, right, is that if you get good education, everything that you have been given, all the tools, even to express mathematics, science, and whatever else, it seems in English. So the problem then that you encounter, and I completely agree with you, that we need to be learning in isiXhosa and everything else, but whenever one enters into that discussion, the problem that comes up is that, practically speaking, we have not been engaging with the tools of knowledge in isiXhosa. We have not been developing mathematical language, scientific language. And I want to ask, how do we come back to that? How do we combat that today? That we can begin to actually engage in sort of subjects that are globally important in our own languages?
You raise a very important question. And it's about government, and government policies coming. It's a fact that today, English, let's say South Africa or Kenya, is the language of power. We cannot mask that and say that if I know Zulu and I'm going to apply for a job, physics, where I get it before an English speaker, right? So it's a struggle and be a combination of as well as government policies. There's nothing that says that English should be or must be the language of power, meaning it's the language of education, it's the language of administration, it's the language of justice, it's everywhere, right? And whether I like it or not, I must cope with the language of power, whatever it is. And as a parent, it's natural for me to want my child to engage with the language of power, because I want him to get a job tomorrow. You go to the Ministry of Finance, for instance. Right? Or to university or other places. So I'm feeling sympathetic. So I'm not saying the task is easy, but we must also ask our governments to change their policies on African languages. And let me add this, since we are there. There's nothing, now say this very clearly, there's nothing wrong with English, French, or any other language for that matter. There are many things we can learn from what's contained in English language or French and so on. But it's also equally true of Zulu, or Xhosa, and so on. What's wrong with languages is not that language don't have something to give to other languages, but rather languages are seen in hierarchical relationship, right? It's hierarchy. Okay. My language is better than your language. My language is inherently more of a language than your language. English is inherently more logical than your language. And this has the imperial logic. And there's a reason for it. I don't want to go into that quite quickly. The imperial logic all the time, and is the one who is governing our societies today, that in order for me to be healthy, there must be 5 others who are unhealthy. So I must pass my leprosy to another 5 people in order for me to be healthy, right? And so the same thing logic, in order for English to be, or the language of power to be, other language must cease to be. That's logic. But actually language can relate differently, like network. In such a situation, hierarchy collapses, network kicks in. Yeah. So what I'm advocating really is a concerted effort. Government policies with the resources put into the policies, but also a mental revolution in all our scholars and educators as well. Right? Government policies by themselves cannot bring about this, and goodwill among scholars and writers cannot bring it about, because government policies are the ones who determine which kind of books will be available in schools and which will not be, how many hours are spent on this and that, how much money goes to training teachers so they're adequately prepared, even though they're using an African language and so on. So you are raising a very complex thing. I don't minimize by any standards, the challenges before us. What took about 60 years or 100 years to mess up may well take a few more years to write up.
I mean, I just on that, interestingly, in the 1980s, Japan, right, became the second most powerful country in the world, right? They were producing videos and all kinds of technologies. And they were not doing that because they were speaking English. And they were learning all of that stuff in Japanese. I mean, India is leading in information technology, but if you go to, Bangalore, they're not doing that stuff in English. China is, right, leading the world in many, many ways. Children learn in Mandarin. So there's nothing inherently scientific about any one particular language. The lady, you? And then I'll come to this, to this section here.
Thank you, Paul, for such a provocative lecture. I think one thing that we agree on is the fact that colonialism is a multi-layered history, which is also intersectional in nature. So my question to you is, in our endeavor to decolonize ourselves, but also being careful that we do not reproduce the same structures that we fought in colonialism and that we continue fighting every day. How do we use language, as violent as it is, especially in terms of gender, to decolonize ourselves without reproducing the same structures? Because I think in the language of colonialism, but also in our own mother languages, there is an element of structural violence, but also gender violence through that language. So how do we decolonize ourselves without undermining the problem of gender inequality, but also accepting each other?
That's very, very important. But I don't want to give the impression that if we learn our languages and all the problems are going to go away. You cannot do terrible things with an African language. It's like having, a good example is, a sword, a very sharp instrument. And you can use it to cut firewood for burning, or sometimes you can use arm to another person, right? So language per se is not by itself the solution. Is the structural relationship that it reflects. Okay? And if you look at gender relationship, quite frankly, it's the hierarchical relation of body to body, right? Meaning, can I just give one? I'm dying to say this. Can I say it? Yes. Okay. The body, this body, your body, my body, the human body, is an incredible machine in so many ways. Everything we have done in the world today is a projection of the human body. Say, let's take one of the organs. Say, legs. Is the idea of motion moving from, in fact, I'll try it. So you can see, I'm moving, right? And I can move up to there and even beyond. And then if I have 200 more years to go, I can actually go around the world on foot, okay? So, transport, for the bicycles and that, only enhances that capacity which is already inherent in the human body. Okay? Take hands, for instance. You know, the hand, sometimes what the hands can do. You see, machines are even imitating, like those big machines that lift stones. You know, and it's very, very awkward young sometimes. Their joints are yet not as supple as those of a human being, right? But in other words, it's really, the tool is an extension of the power of the hand. You know, tools are an extension of what is already inherent in the human body, right? You can give somebody a blow, or you can take a stone. It's extending the power of the body. Now, the same with everything. Ears tell us all the technology of hearing, all technologies of seeing in the telescope and so on. We already have it. And you know what? The last frontier is with the area of the brain. But guess what the computer is doing? It's imitating the human brain. Also the naming system, we come to that. You see the way the body is structured, the head, and the rest of the body? Now note this, the head talks as if it owns the body, my body, my face, right? The head, we think of the head as a location of reason. Don't be emotional, meaning use the head, use your head, right? Not the emotion. We think of the lower part of the body as a productive area, but a very emotional area, right? Of the body. So, in the naming, at least in English language, when you talk about kings and presidents, we call them heads of state. Head, the naming system. Head of state. Okay? We know the hierarchy of God and God. We think God as the head of the universe, or the head of the angels and all that. And we think God as the embodiment of coolness and reason. Yes, we think of the head as the embodiment of coolness and reason. The rest of the body, which is good for the rest of the masses, is the site of both production and emotion. Look at the family structure. It was actually the same thing, right? Men, as the head of the family, head, cool head. And think, you want judgment, you go to the man. Woman producing another side of emotion and all that. And that's actually that structure of sort of the even gender different type of qualities supposed to have and so on are a reflection of that structure. In reality, of course, no part of the body can do without the others. And I want to direct your attention to, if the time, you go to the internet, I don't know if the site is still there, but read my story called The Upright Revolution, or Why Humans Walk Upright. It has now been translated, I don't think a cool language is now translated, I think, in 61 languages in the world, 40 African, 6 European, 6 Asian, and into Middle Eastern and so on. It continues. I think it's available in its course, I think. But anyway, what I'm trying to say, that structure of naming is inherent in many other languages because it's reflecting that way of thinking of things as hierarchical relationship, not in terms of a relational, network relationship. Because in reality, no part of the body can do without the other, right? They have to work together. Man and woman have to work together. Okay?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I've been asked to call out these cars. They're blocking the Fort Hare bus. Registration DYF 428. If your car has a registration DYF 428, and the other one is FLV 487. I hope you know your registration plate, otherwise it's not going to help. All right, any questions from this section? I want a young, yeah, you at the back. I got these on too.
Thanks. I hear about the notion of languages, how they should be incorporated as a means not just in literature, but as a science, in geography, and in psychology, all those other issues. The issue I have is that, okay, I understand there must be policy, that there's a government that has to go through. I mean, you can't just say, I want, maths to be taught in Zulu, and then bang, it happens. I know there's a process, but I'm asking the question that's kind of, I think that will be a bit different. We say like this: how would we approach it how would we mobilize the people to embrace this? I mean, it's one thing for you to get the government to agree, but how do you embrace the people to embrace this idea? Because what you're saying is very good, and what's saying is I don't have a problem with the languages, but my only question is, how in the world do we get the people to embrace this? Because as long as they seem distant from it, there will be some that sit here, but no movement will happen in the long run.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the people. For instance, why are we? Hello?
Bueno.
What happened?
Me? Hello?
What happened? Hello? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, now. Oh yes. Now, first let me just take a very concrete example. We are here today talking about themes of decolonization. He is trying to get me over here. Particularly since the fall of Cicero's statue. Right. And also many organizations have been asking about the time factor is impossible to find a time factor. But the demand is very high. And I know this because I'm receiving incredible audiences in Joburg, in Cape Town, and other places. It's because there is a movement of young people who are saying, guess what? Let's decolonize, right? So that's a very important movement. Now, we try to turn that movement also into concrete something. But there's no reason why, even if we fight for government policies, there's no reason why we cannot ask the institutions, please, before I know about Plato and Aristotle and so on, let me do something about Ubuntu and any other thing that's here in South Africa. And then I relate that to what other philosophers in the continent, other philosophers in Europe. That way, it actually empowers me. If I start here in South Africa, it will empower me to confront Plato or Aristotle, or if I start from South Africa, then go around up to Egypt, I'll be able to confront Plato and other thinkers. I'll be able to confront or to interact with Asian philosophies and so on. Yeah. So it starts, every starts from where we are. Parents, yeah, we are parents, one from our potential parents. I know this in Kenya and other places, that is parents who beat their children if they don't have an English accent. Parents, I went to a place where parents will call their children with visitors and their children are playing outside, they say, so and so, come here. But this is their language. They come, they speak to them in their language in front of you. The children, of course, answer in English. And the parents look very mournful. Oh, our children, they don't speak our language. But they're not that saying that really in sorrow. They are proud of the fact that their children don't speak an African language, right? So, even we parents have a role to play. You know, me, you, every parent who is here, right? But please always remember, if you empower your child in an African language, you're also empowering him in understanding how languages work at home. Meaning, he's more disposed actually to acquire more languages or even to understand many more things. A child, in my case, I remember this in my own case, we used to go in homes where there was slaughtering cattle and goats and so on. And children were expected to be around, especially their boys, sorry about the gender thing. Boys are supposed to actually help. And they knew all the parts of it. You know, they say the goat or the cow, they know. So, in Zulu or whatever language they come from, they go to school. And they're told, okay, now let's human anatomy or animal anatomy. And they hear the word anatomy, and they think it's nothing to do with what they were actually doing at home. Right? So how they are given these English words, so the English words for anatomical part becomes now something you cram. It's not connected to actually the knowledge you already have. Right? You know, if we use the knowledge we already have, it's more empowering. We're able to acquire more knowledge because we're able to see the difference, similarities, or other issues, even in science, right? So we parents have also a role to play in this, as well as governments, of course, yeah.
And I'll just give you one example. In my department at UCT, when I got there, I said to my colleagues, you know, we like Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams has got a book called Keywords. And if you want to know every sociological concept, you go to Keywords. So I said to my colleagues, me and a colleague called Jacques Duver, I said, why can't we do sociology in this course? Or this is, and other languages. So we are developing keywords, sociological concepts in this course, and this is at UCT. Why can't we do it for her? So that one day we develop in sociology in this course and this is. So these are, sometimes these things may seem look so far off, but sometimes it's a question of like just asking ourselves the most basic questions. Let me Sandra.
Nice.
Yes, well, this is okay, and then yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
And then I'm gonna come to
Don't keep this one. Come on.
Greetings to everyone. My question is very small, Professor.
no question is small.
Okay, let's say short. How do you teach a child their mother tongue at home and then expect them to go to school to learn in English, but also expect them not to be confused between the two? As you said, sometimes you learn the same concept in another language, but viewed to be something totally different. So how do you teach them your language, then they be taught the school language without necessarily jeopardizing either?
They are never confused. Yeah. The parents confuse them because we're not even I have suffered from that. Okay, if you're not consistent, you can even make a child lose his original contact with the language. Let's say there are two parents. I mean, father and mother. One says Spanish speaking the language. Yeah. And the other one is Xhosa speaking and so on. all they have to do is be consistent. When they tell the children, come back. What happened? Hello? Yeah. Always, oh my God, sounds so powerful. All they have to do is become consistent. And the children will acquire not only that the two languages as native speaker. With English, since English is the language of power, quite frankly, you don't even have to do anything about English as a parent. They'll acquire it anyway. Yeah.
Okay, last person from this section, and then we're going to move on there. I want to acknowledge you, Professor Kusede, one of the experts on Ngugi in history. Professor Kusede, please stand up so we can all acknowledge you.
Good afternoon to everyone. I just have one question. The lady at the back asked about the structural violence of language and how to counter that, and you alluded to something that doesn't necessarily answer the question. Yes, we understand that language is a tool that is used in an inherently violent system. However, it's still a tool. Now, how do we dismantle that tool so that it is no longer violent, so that it is no longer violent to any other woman or any marginalized group anywhere? Thanks.
Language of course, but remember, historically, all I would be saying in this lecture tonight is how language was weaponized against African people. It turned to a weapon of war against us. Okay? But there's no reason why we cannot, like a sharp anger, we cannot turn it to work for us. Yeah. And all I'm saying, hello? Yeah. There's no reason why we cannot turn it to work for us. That's why I keep on repeating all the time, because some people mistake me. They think I have something against English and so on. That's why I keep on emphasizing the question of enslavement and empowerment. And I say, what's wrong? How many languages the person who said quite fast? I know he spoke Swahili. Huh? Yeah, there was a demonstration here. Where is he? What's his name?
Gangule.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, please stand up. We see you again. We didn't actually see how, if you don't realize how many languages he went through, smoothly.
Let me. I think the question. Let me add to your question. Having changed, let's say, this language policy and adopted, how do we make our languages less sexist, less violent towards women? Right? In other words, I think the question that is being raised in different ways is that we can change the language, we can have everything taught in isiXhosa or isiZulu, but the structural relationships, right, of violence and remain, right? And the question is, how do we change that?
Remember, language is a reflection of structural relations in society also, right? I once was telling everyone I was speaking, and somebody said, I said, oh, in the beginning was sound, because there's sound in everything. And then somebody, I told Nigeria, said, but before sound there was movement, because you cannot make sound without movement. Okay? Now, in the same way with language and so on, the question of making our languages less anti-one to another should be is a conscious fight. Just as within English, we have fought against the use of black negativities or other things, we have to do the same with our language. But more important, we have to fight so that we have to fight consciously by every means possible. So for there is no violence say, against women at home and in the streets, for instance, right? Yeah, so language, yes, but also what is reflected by that language, we have to consciously fight for it, for that equality. Because actually, in reality, it's the equality of, if I might use the word, the equality of the sexes, if I might put that way, where progress lies. Okay. I was very impressed by a young lady. Where was her name? Where is she? Oh, this lady, she eats books all the time. Well, not quite, she eats food as well. Yeah, but really, what I'm saying is that, and I have also met, and again, I've been impressed by many of the women I've met here, actually, in place of power and so on, like the head of this program and so on. But whatever we do, our languages is not an excuse for maintaining a lot of those prejudices against other communities who are African, or for against other communities who may not be African as well. So the struggle for equality still continues, and this will be reflected also in language and changes in language. Okay. Okay. Even within English, there have been a lot of struggle over this, like the use of her and him and so on. Try to use non-gendered pronouns.
We are in this section now, so we are in this section now, not that section, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Prof. In one of your writings, you've mentioned that, I quote, that every language has its own social and cultural basis, and they're instrumental in the formation of mental processes and value judgments. And now today you spoke about the metaphysics. So my question is, how would you relate the metaphysics of the being and the statement? And what are the immediate steps that we, as the youth of South Africa, should take in order to fulfill this aim of decolonizing English?
First of all, again, I think there should be demands, not for proportionate support of our languages, not disproportionate 90% of resources going to English, and minuscule little things going to African languages, or paying homage to African languages in words, or in saying one or two proverbs, or one or two jokes, or one or two songs, and then we go to the norm. But quite frankly, it is a struggle. But let us suggest one thing we can immediately do. Let's use the principle of from here to there in everything, and we shall do wonders. From here to here means whatever you do with languages, we start with the language which nearest us, then we go on adding other languages. Okay. If it's intellectual tradition, we start, like South Africa has this, I don't know how to describe how important the intellectual tradition of South Africa by black African intellectuals is. We can start by demanding that is a literature department, we should be aware of those writers. Then once we know about them, it's easier to relate them to other African writers, to other English writers, to Asian writers, and so on. So the question of demand, here, is important. But in everything, quite frankly, it is a struggle. But for the time being, we can make use of this decolonial movement to actually make specific demands that can actually be met. Like insisting, let's first of all study African philosophy from South Africa, then connecting it to other philosophies in that order. Let's, another example, you want to know about rivers of Europe and so on. Let's start by knowing about rivers around us. If I live here in, I don't know how to call it, in this place, they call East London. Oh, Kai City, oh, sorry. Yeah, Muntu, huh? Muntu. Oh, okay, so there's a name for it. If I live here, and I know the names and even the functioning of plants here, around us here, it's easier for me to recognize other trees in Johannesburg, either which are different from the ones we grow here, or which are similar. And with that knowledge, it's easy for me to go and see other trees that grow in Kenya. Oh my God, this is similar when planted, all different and so on. The same and gone to Europe and so on. So I want increasing my knowledge of plants and plant life and their properties. You know, God. Yeah. So that's something you can immediately actually ask for, and we shall get it.
I want to also just add an example about how important this thing of starting from where we are, also in terms of, you know, I don't know how I can't overemphasize this. There's a magazine in the UK called Times Higher Education or Times Literary something. But anyway, they did a story about me. But the headline was Black Intellectual Traditions of South Africa. That is why they ran the story. Because for them, it's, wow, there is this history in South Africa of black intellectual production over 200 years. So for me, even this issue of language has to be located within that project. So that when you read Ngugi, right, and you want to talk about these ideas, you have to read him in isiXhosa, or you have to read her in isiXhosa. You have to read them in all the languages. I mean, Imvo Zabantsundu, for example, right? I mean, it was published in both English and isiXhosa. And people didn't have to choose. So what I'm saying is also in dealing with this question of language, let us locate it within this broader intellectual space project that needs to go on. And then language will organically become part of that space. And people who want to express themselves, in whatever language they want to express themselves, will put their stuff on the table. And things will happen. So we can't be too mechanistic in a way about it. We just have to do it. We'll take... Are you tired now, right?
Yeah. No, continue. No, can you see?
You and then the lady at the back.
Thank you, Prof. Part of the decolonization agenda relates to the decolonization of curriculum. Now, in understanding that the language itself is a mere communication method, how do we then ensure that we empower language insofar as decolonization the curriculum? Because it does not make sense to say we must empower language, whereas you have got the psychology, the content of psychology, whereas the only thing that we're going to just use sociology in isiXhosa. How do we then decolonize even the content itself using the language? Thank you.
Yeah, it's how do you go beyond just the language to the conceptual foundations of what is the sociology of SK Kaya, right? In other words, how do you go to the lab? I think I answered your question, right? It's not a matter of language, it's a matter of saying, what did African people say and think and write? And that becomes the new sociology. And I don't think it's limited to sociology. I was just using more than a sociology.
Can I also do a quick example? Hello? What happened?
I think somebody is sabotaging.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah. Hello?
I wanted a power, which I had before. Anyway, let me say this. If you look at philosophy in general, whether German philosophy or Greek philosophy, is often an expansion of what the language is already saying about the world. Because every language and its structure is saying something about the world, their view of the universe. Okay? So philosophy often is an expansion of concepts and conceptualizations which are already in the language. An example, though not a perfect one. Now we talk about gendered language all the time, but we forget that some African languages don't have the notion of gender in terms of, you say someone is left, we don't know whether someone is a woman or a man. We don't have the he, she, it division. It's just a way that language is. So, if you look at philosophy generally, it's an extension of what the language is. If you look at the 10 categories of Aristotle, for instance, really it's only an explanation of categories which are already there in Greek language, okay? So, at the very starting point, each of our languages is not simply a tool of communication, it's also a means of many other things as well. It's a view of the world contained in that communication system. If we say all languages have the property of communication system, and communication is basic to all life, even to our biological bodies, right? Because our cells are communicating with each other. The reason I am lifting my hand and waving at you like that, or with my leg dance, is my brain is transmitted very, very quickly from the brain to my leg and trying to lift it or move this way. Okay? So, but every language is more than communication. It becomes a carrier of attitudes, of concepts, of emotions, of other things. Okay? So, quite apart from communication, there's a world view carried by those languages. And we can start by expanding those views inherent in our own languages.
Yes, Sissy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bob. I want to ask this question.
Use the microphone, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. I want to ask this question. I come from a patriarchal society, West Africa, Yoruba. Women are considered inferior to men. For you to succeed as a woman, you have to have every weapon you have intellectually to defend. My point is, to what extent can we promote the indigenous languages and not become irrelevant in the society? Let me explain, Prof. For me to get a job in the university as a graduate assistant, French lecturer, I had to speak my French through my nose because I was the only female candidate who presented herself for that job. Others were male. And I said, God, family, everybody waiting for me. How am I going to get this job? If I go there, you said there was no originality in mimicry, but I needed it. And I needed to succeed in the society. So as I got there, I was speaking French through my nostrils. I got the job. Now I studied Chinese language, and when I came back from China, I was still young in the university, but I was recognized. Each time the vice chancellor has delegates from the university, they say, there's a young woman who speaks Chinese language. You pay me instantly. You don't pay, I buy fuel in my car. I won't respond to you. So if I had studied, fine. I believe in my indigenous language and I want to promote it. But you see, if I had continued, I would become irrelevant. One poor teacher with nothing, I would have nothing to show for. And I want to be relevant to myself, relevant to the nation, relevant to the society, Prof. I agree with you that these languages need to be promoted, but how do we do that without becoming irrelevant in the society? Thank you very much.
I mean, sorry, Ngugi has asked me to deputize for him. He wants to think about it a little bit. But I really don't think that it goes back to the earlier discussion. That really what we've done, we have associated our own languages with weakness. I mean, you know, I mean, the Japanese, as I was saying earlier on, right? They became the second most powerful industrial country in the world, doing everything in Japanese. China is the second most powerful country in the world, doing everything in Mandarin. So I think that the question is a political one. Is how do we, as societies, begin to build our political power? I think the issue really is that language itself is not a solution. It has to be located within a political economy, and then it becomes part of that. But to think that you can control the political economy without the language means that you're not drawing on your own natural intelligence. So you'll be in the political economy, but you'll forever be higher instead of creating your own economy. So I think what's at stake here, I think, is a question of what is the relationship of language to culture, as one of you was saying. How do you relate language to the economy? How do you relate language to politics? But to say the only way we can make it in the world is by joining in with the others will only mean, right, that, listen to me carefully, will only mean that you as an individual may make it. But the community as a whole, as a structure, will remain in a position of subservience. Right? And that is where we are in our country today. If I can speak good English, I can get that job. But everybody else will not be able to do, because I have not done anything for the society. I have elevated myself, I've trained myself, I've become an expert, but the society and the people around me, right? So these are big questions, and I'm glad we're having them and that they are being raised. Let's go to that corner there, right?
Let me quickly add, that's related to the question of languages, of whether I like it or not. European languages are the languages of power in Africa, right? So you know French and English and so on, you get a job much faster, or even get a job than someone who comes and says, I speak perfect Yoruba, and so on, okay? So it's a question of power. But there's nothing in French or that makes them inherently languages of power. They have been made so by, you like, politics, right? That's why they're languages of power. But they're languages are inherently in themselves as language. Today, and I hope that's not happening, if the Yoruba people conquered the Europeans, for instance, and made Yoruba the language of power in Europe, every European child would be glad to learn Yoruba, if it's a language of power. When I talk to African Americans, I tell them, please understand the language you speak is not a lower rank on the ladder to Scotland English heaven. But at the same time, you have to come to terms with the language of power, whatever it is, because we're competing for jobs and so on. So these changes we're talking about have also come from the politics. You put it very, very well. I don't want to repeat that. But let me give you some homework, please. Also, can I give you some homework? Yeah, Professor. Other congratulations. Now, the only homework which I'm going to give you is, I want you to use your knowledge of French, okay? On Chinese. And whenever you have time, please translate some things from Chinese into Yoruba. Right?
Okay, at the corner there.
You see, what I also... You see, what I've also noticed about the language is the point of attitude that we have towards ourselves. For instance, we tend to undermine people who are not proficient in English language. That is common amongst the people. For instance, young people using social media. At one stage, you see, they tended to voice out some insults against a musician called Mendoza because they said that he was not good in English. You see, there are also other individuals who have been undermined just because they are considered to be, you see, to be not sophisticated enough if they don't speak the English language. And also another thing, you see, that happens is that among the vocabulary of the isiXhosa language, you find some words are no longer used or they are considered to be vulgar. For instance, if you say upunyoko, upuyiko, or ingazana, you see young people tend to regard such use of those words as if we are in a way rude. You see, those are some of the things that even I'm happy that Professor Ngugi also touched on the middle class, because the middle class, if you listen to the radio, for instance, to the talk show on language,
could you please
okay, I'm summarizing it. You find that the people who have got access to such radio stations that are in English really oppose the use of Xhosa languages and also African languages to educate young people.
I do want to say, before Ngugi responds, that it should be perfectly legitimate, actually, for young people or people in society to say, you know what, maybe this term is not as acceptable today as it was back then. You know, no language should be stuck in one place where if people find a particular term offensive, then that term should be debated, and that's how we answer this question of how do we, that's how we answer your question of if uti unyo. If it worked back then, it doesn't mean it's going to work today. So with our own, that's how I think we can deal with this issue of violence in our languages. Because the violence is there in so many ways in our languages. So we shouldn't romanticize our languages. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. Even as we change. How many more questions? I think that we're going to end on that point of not romanticizing our languages. Let me thank Professor Ngugi Thiong'o for the time that he has given us. And we can't all be able to answer our questions, unfortunately. Okay, man, I can tell you the word. Oh, I got it, boy. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, then, guy. Yeah, okay, go ahead, man. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions. No, we can't. We have to be fair. We have to be fair. We have to be fair. We've been here for quite a while now.
My question to you firstly is that don't you think that I hear you are starting a foundation of yourself? Who? Yeah. I heard that you are starting a foundation for yourself. This is my point of departure. Don't you think that it's better to collaborate with other already existing foundations of other prominent African literaries or prominent people so that you can build capacity in that way instead of different foundations all around? That is a point of departure. The one I'm coming to is that how do we decolonize, or is it possible to decolonize using colonial vehicles? For instance, you spoke about decolonizing or changing the names of cities through policies. Now that's government, now that's politics. Now you look at politics and the introduction of government to the African continent. It was a colonial project which the power and legitimacy were taken from the people that ruled, and was taken from the people that ruled into now a democratic state, which was imposed by Europe. Now, how do we decolonize using colonial vehicles? Is it possible to decolonize using colonial
foundation? Mine will be very specific on promotion of African languages. Yeah, that I'm going to focus on that. Anything to do with African languages, it will be in support of that. It's a pet project, but I think it's a very important project. But that doesn't mean that one foundation cannot cooperate with others with similar objectives and so on. Okay? Different foundations are founded for with different objectives to serve certain ideas. Mine is specifically related to African languages, and I'll be willing to collaborate with just about anybody and any organization as long as our common ground is empowering African languages. Yeah.
And I'm here to say, Ngugi, that we will collaborate with you in every way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm just going to take a photo of my brother. I think they're part of the background. Bendingafika iphelile benino 7 gig. Bendingafika iphelile okwendi hotspot ngayo. Ura? Japet. Online, free, like access to that. I have more people are subscribed to free. I'm going to subscribe to free. Don't pay for the thing. The more, let's not pay. Our latest